This panel has 4 amazing professionals that come from different industries. Their experiences with diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives is unparalleled. I am honored to welcome them to this panel to share with us the challenges and successes that they have faced in their diversity journey. Without further delay, I invite our wonderful moderator, Jennifer Peneyra, the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion of Silicon Valley Bank, to kick off our panel. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Patty, for the warm introduction. And I'm so excited to be here today and join this amazing panel of speakers and on one of my favorite topics, diversity, equity, inclusion. Certainly not an easy topic by any means, but definitely a worthwhile one. And I see we've got over 100 attendees already online, which is great. And so I would like to actually go ahead and start by inviting the panelists to come on camera and unmute yourself. I think you can introduce yourself better than I can. And so I want to make sure we do you justice. And I'll start. As Patty noted, I am the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Director at Silicon Valley Bank. I've been with the bank a little over 5 years now. And as we ask our panelists to introduce yourselves, I'd like you to introduce your, say your name, your role within your organization, how long you've been there, and introduce also what we'll call the operating definition of diversity within your organization. As we know, it's called different things in different groups. And so for SVB, we like to approach it as a diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity speaking to representation in our workforce, equity speaking to access to opportunities in our systems, and then also inclusion, talking about our workplace culture. So, Peter, I'll start with you. Introduce yourself, please. Oh, you're on mute.
You would think after being home for a year, I would have gotten that one down. But thanks for having me today. My name is Peter Gallum, the Chief Creative Officer of DreamWorks Animation Television in Los Angeles. And I've been here almost 10 years. We started the television unit about 8 years ago. At DreamWorks and NBC Universal, we also speak to diversity, equity, and inclusion in our programming.
Great, thanks, Peter. And Steffi, let's have you introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Steffi Gascón Hafen. I am a partner at the law firm of Snell and Wilmer. I'm in our private client services and general federal tax groups. And our firm also defines it as diversity, equity, inclusion, and it includes, the terms are broadly used for race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, accessibility, and some veterans issues as well. And I help the firm kind of by being an advocate on the ground floor, also from a leadership perspective as a partner of the firm, and in our hiring practices on the hiring committee.
Wonderful. Thank you, Steffi. And I'll leave it to our law firm representative to speak to the protected classes when we talk about diversity. So thank you for clarifying and defining those terms. And then Kirk, let's have you introduce yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kirk Snyder, and I'm a professor of business communication at USC in the Marshall School of Business. I'm also an alum of USC in the School of Business. And I've been at USC for 22 years in an administrative capacity as well as faculty. And university has really done amazing, I believe, work in this space of diversity, equity, and inclusion for students, for faculty, for staff. And I think I'm really excited to speak relative to the workplace. I also write a lot about the workplace. And I think my research area in terms of people being valued for who they are as an individual is really centered around a lot of what we do, getting students ready for the world of work and a career where who they are is valued by their employer.
Thank you for sharing that, Kirk. And I appreciate both your perspective from that being in academia and talking about what's happening on the university but then also being able to speak as a nationally recognized workplace expert and seeing what you're seeing across industry and different organizations. And so as our audience can tell, we have a very diverse panel in terms of different industries represented, different backgrounds and roles within each organization, and really looking forward to having a conversation with all of you. I encourage the audience, if questions come up as we're going through our dialogue, you can leverage the Q&A feature to ask your questions. I can't guarantee that we'll get to all of them, but we'll certainly try to address them as they're aligned with our conversation today. So I think the first question is, as Patty noted, we want to talk about workplace diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. I'd love to hear from each of you what your role, which you've told us a little bit, and from your perspective, how has the DE&I space evolved to the current stage that it is today? And if you could share some of the best practices at your organization that illustrates this evolution. And so, Kirk, I'd love to start with you again from the viewpoint of higher education as well as your research.
Absolutely. Well, I think in higher education across the board, we are seeing senior leadership roles being focused on DEI, appointing, creating new roles at university levels, at school-based levels. And I also think there's a real focus in the classroom, which is relative to preparing the future leaders, in the world of work. I think that's where the work begins, to make sure that everyone is having a voice. And I think for me as a professor, that's really where it sort of begins, which is making sure that everyone's voice is heard in a classroom, that people are seeing themselves represented in case studies, for example, that we're studying relative to whatever the discipline might be. And I just think it is so important to think about where we want to go and think about the role that listening plays. We can only all speak to our own experience. I mean, I can truly only speak to my experience as a gay man coming of age, for example, in the 1980s, at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. I know what that's like. I don't haven't experienced life through other people's shoes. And I think once we can recognize that, we have an opportunity to really open our ears and listen. And I think that's where the evolution of getting to where we want to go in this space really begins, from a communication standpoint of creating self-awareness among everyone that's at the table, making sure everyone is at the table, and thinking about how we're using self-regulation, because words matter. That can inspire, and it can also disengage people, and that's not what we need to get where we want to go. So I think listening. I think it comes down to listening without judgment.
Awesome. Thank you so much for walking us through that, Kirk, and also sharing a little bit of your story and your background. And there is an element of the empathy and active listening that's at play these days, I think so much more now than ever. So thank you. And we'll get back to you in a little bit, because there are a couple of points you touched on that I want to dig a little deeper on. But in the meantime, Steffi, would love to hear from you what you're seeing in the law firm world.
Yeah, so I think law firms for a long time have put a value on diversity inclusion and had this be a talking point. I mean, you can go to any law firm and they certainly say things on their webpage. But really, you start to get higher up in law firms in terms of seniority and power partners, that kind of thing, and the diversity numbers aren't so great. And that's across the entire profession. And I've seen a big evolution from just talking about it and to putting things on our website to really having action and to really trying to do something about the numbers and the inclusion ratios and all that kind of stuff. And so something that we've done at the firm is we started in the wake of the murders this year. We started a discussion panel where every week we have people come in to talk about their experiences from diverse backgrounds, with the idea being that if we share more perspective, we hear more voices, we can all learn. Because one of the, through no fault of our own, we all have the benefit of our own perceptions, our own reality. And so by hearing other voices, we can learn a little bit more, especially if we listen with an open heart and open mind. But with that thought in mind as well, though, it can't just be the responsibility of people who have been through the experiences to always be educating. So we've just been doing a lot more with boots on the ground to increase our diversity and inclusion efforts. So for example, we've been working a lot more with data. So there's something about having data that can promote accountability. And if you can't track the progress, then there's no way for you to really measure it. So we started a few years ago, but we're really honing in on using data to track not only our recruitment efforts, but our retainment, our advancement, all of those sorts of things. We've also really made sure that from the leadership, it's a top down. So you can really feel that, before there was lots of lawyers are really good at getting involved in boards and doing pro bono. It's part of our charge as being a lawyer. It's part of the mission that we agree to when we become, part of the California State Bar. But as opposed to just a lot of people siloed kind of doing their own thing, they're interested in this, they're interested in that. There's been a much bigger focus from the top down within our firm. And I think we had it before, but it's just, again, a little bit more accountability as well. And the idea being that the gatekeepers and the leaders can really drive some of the cultural changes as well. And we also have a lot of programs that are dedicated to giving back to the community, but the lawyers are involved in the process. So the hope is that through that, you're really creating institutional change as well. So through first generation programs at law schools, mentoring opportunities for people interested in going to law school, helping with organizations and people of diverse backgrounds being elevated at the bench, judges, because that really makes a big difference. And then also we this last year got involved in the law firm Anti-Racism Alliance, which is a lot of the big firms, or not a lot, but the ones who got involved, donating their time, resources, expertise to helping to seek out laws on the books that perpetuate racial inequities, and not just racial, I should say, diversity inequities, whether it be from any of the protected classes, because that's part of our mission also as lawyers, is a lot of this work can be done from a legal perspective that can't be done just with other grassroots initiatives. So there's lots of different ways that we've been doing this with lots of different efforts, and the goal being not only are we giving a voice to the people who've had maybe diverse experiences, because it's not just their job to educate all, but trying to create more allies and accountability within the firm as well.
Wonderful, Steffi. Thank you so much to unpack in all the great insights you've just shared. And so we'll come to a few, but a few things that resonate with me right away is just that accountability piece. And in fact, there's one question that came up in the chat feature. And again, I invite the audience to ask questions as we go along. How are we collecting data? And so I can take a stab at my initial response to that. When we talk about diversity, it is about representation. And so we can ask employees to self-ID different dimensions of diversity, whether it's gender, race, sexual orientation. I know law firms collect that information as well, and some organizations do as well. But just know that workforce diversity is just one snapshot. And so if you start looking not only at the hiring, but then the retention and advancement, because to Steffi's point, across industries, most organizations you look at, you'll see the most diversity at the most junior levels. And yet when you start to look up the leadership ladder, it's not as representative as the general workforce or even our general population in the communities in which we work. So we know there's more work to be done in terms of building that inclusive workplace where diverse talent can thrive and actually build a career and advance. So that's one piece of it, but also from a qualitative perspective, and we'll get to the inclusion piece in a little bit, it's how do people feel once they're in the door and how do you measure that? It's so subjective, right? And so some things that organizations can do, and I see Kirk, you're nodding your head here, are doing engagement surveys, just surveying employees, like what's the temperature? How are you feeling? How does it feel to show up at work every day? Do you feel like you have a voice? Do you feel respected? Do you feel like you belong? And so those are some of the data points that help drive that accountability. So thank you for sharing that, Steph, and also the question here. And, you know, another thing, Steffi, that voice, representation matters. And so Peter, I'd love to give you a voice and share, what you're doing in the creative arts space, particularly when you think about building content for audience and representation on the screen and behind the scenes, as we talked about during our prep call.
Yeah, so we are a different kind of organization. We're part of NBC Universal, which is part of Comcast, so it's a giant multinational corporation. But within DreamWorks alone, we have over 2,000 people, many of whom are artists, technicians, lawyers. We have so many different kinds of people represented in our workforce. And I can talk. First of all, I just want to mention that in the past year we formed a lot of new committees focused on DEI. One around sourcing and outreach, one around retention and leadership, and a third one around culture and employee engagement. And these committees are everything from entry level and even interns up to senior leadership. So we've been using those committees as a way to incubate new ideas. I think we have that representation piece both here at the company and, as you said, on screen. And I think the on-screen piece is something we've been on top of for a long time. We've really worked to have our shows represent America and the world, and we have, I think, a really good track record of representation on screen. We have a lot of diverse protagonists, and we've particularly been at the vanguard of LGBTQ representation in kids and family media with shows like She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, which has a tremendous amount of and different types of relationships, and Kipo and the Age of Wonder Beast. So we've been doing pretty well on screen. I think behind the screen in terms of the talent is where we're really focused now. We're really focused on how we elevate voices and lift up a more diverse range of voices, and how we get more people in the craft of making the shows and giving voice to the shows. And one of the key things for me has been to encourage around the company the last few years. One of our best practices is that we are not hiring people, that we're building careers. So we invest very heavily in building careers. We started a new division about 3 years ago called Creative Talent Management. And it's a team of about 3 or 4 people here at the studio whose sole job is to know the artists, know where they want to go in their lives and their careers, know their talents and passions and interests, and be able to help guide them to the next opportunity. And we're really proud that a lot of people, we have many, many cases of people starting as an intern who became a storyboard revisionist, who became a storyboard artist, who became a director, who became a supervising director, who became a showrunner, or the same on the writing side. So really investing, putting your money where your mouth is and investing in building careers, I think is one of our key best practices.
Wonderful. I love that, Peter, the notion of building careers. It's not just a job. And I think that's something that hopefully should resonate with the students on the call today, or early career professionals. In fact, anyone on their career journey, is that hopefully you can find an organization where you can envision yourself growing your career, not just another job or another paycheck. So thank you for sharing that, Peter. And I see a few questions coming in. We'll try to get to them as we go through our conversation. But I do want to touch on a couple of points that were already raised. And Steffi and Peter, you both commented on the events of the past year. And I don't think we can have a current DE&I conversation without recognizing, one, we're still operating amidst a global pandemic. And so just the nature of work itself has changed quite a bit. Most of us used to be in the offices, and now we are working remotely. And so that changes the landscape in terms of an inclusive workplace. But then also just with all of the racial injustices and social injustice movement that has happened over the past years after the death and the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, who, sadly, they weren't the first to fall victim. And sadly, they probably won't be the last. But I think being a captive audience at home, working remotely and sheltering in place, we could no longer unsee what we were seeing. And that has sort of accelerated the DE&I journey for many organizations. As Kirk noted, a lot more senior leadership roles focused on this space. And so along with everything that's transpired in the past year, we've started to hear a lot more conversation around allyship. And I'm mindful, again, thanks to our host, Lambda Legal, or Lambda LGBTQ Alumni Association, as well as USC Outlaw, that for our LGBTQ community, allyship has been a term used to advocate on behalf of LGBTQ inclusion. And I think over the past year, allyship has taken a different term as well, where you'll see the discourse talking about allyship ranging from performative to really active allyship, no longer being bystanders, but upstanders, but also remiss if I didn't call out, we have great diversity on our panel today in terms of background and experience, sexual orientation, job level. Just visually looking, I don't believe we have an African-American or Black person represented on our panel. But that said, I think that gives our panel a real opportunity to speak to allyship and anti-racism. And so, Peter, I'd love to start with you. What approaches or what steps are you as an individual and your organization taking to promote more allyship and anti-racism given the current events?
Yeah, I think a few things. I think I can speak for my organization, but I've also worked at other major studios. I've worked at Disney and Fox and Viacom, and I think they were all similar to some degree in that people cared about DEI issues and talked about them and thought about them, and yet the results weren't enough. And I think that's because people cared, but when business got in the way, other things trumped focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. If your schedule for your show, if the budget for this, there were a lot of things, it was allowed to not be a priority. And I think this year there's been a seismic shift in that. There is a change. In the past, people might have spoken about sponsorship and mentorship. Now there's an expectation that every leader in our organization will be sponsoring and mentoring diverse employees, and once again, trying to build careers. I think in terms of, we've changed our hiring practices this year. One of the things I've put into effect is that when there's an open position on my team, any of my teams, I'm telling people they cannot hire someone unless they've at least met a few people of color. I can't tell them who to hire, but I can say, if you are not meeting people of color, you have not done a full job search. And in the past, it would have been, hey, who is recruiting department sent to us? We meet those people. I was hiring a new assistant earlier this year, and we reviewed all the people that came in through recruiting. The 4 or 5 top candidates were laddered up to me, and there were no diverse candidates in that group. So I sent them back to find people. And they went back, they brought me another round of people to interview, which had, much more diverse. And by far, the top candidate was a person of color. So it's about investing the energy, sometimes to find the people that you want to join your organization, and not just accepting the status quo of whoever is kind of raised up to you. And the other thing I'd say with that is we kind of have to break whatever version of the old boy network. There's many different old boy networks, I guess, but what happens a lot in my business, and I think it happens in a lot of businesses, you have an open position, you fire off emails to people, hey, I need to hire a director of development. Who do you know that's out there? But if your network is a certain group of people and they know a certain group of people, and they're just referring candidates to you that don't ever bring new faces and new voices into your world. So we're stopping doing that, and we're finding new ways to get to candidates.
Great, thank you for walking us through some really tangible, actionable steps that organizations can take, Peter, particularly around the hiring process. Instead of the usual, I got a guy network referral, it's how do we broaden that network and expand it so that we are sourcing talent where we haven't looked before. Because oftentimes they're around the DE&I discussions, people talk about a diversity pipeline issue, that there's a lack of talent, when in fact, maybe if we reframe it, it isn't a lack of talent, it's a lack of opportunity, because we just haven't looked hard enough, or we haven't challenged ourselves against the typical norms or typical networks. And So it's on us as hiring managers, as well as organizations. It's going to take more time, but if you want to get things done right, and if you want to be intentional on diversity, we're for sharing that. Kirk, I know you touched on a little bit, seeing more senior leadership positions focused on DE&I, such that it's driven from the top down. I think Steffi touched this on as well, but there's also still that element of the grassroots level. And particularly for the students on the call who are being more active in this space, what are you seeing that's working really well?
I think one thing that's really working well is making sure that everyone has a voice, and that certainly in the classroom that folks are being able to share what their life experience is around any given subject. So for example, I think, increasing that level of self-awareness has really increased over this last year because of the events that have happened, but I also think because we're living in a Zoom world. So I think the opportunity, for example, in a college class, and maybe some of the students that are on the call have experienced this. In fact, I had a graduate class earlier today, and we were talking about this, which is there's almost a greater sense of intimacy in a Zoom classroom than there is sometimes on ground, relative to people feeling that they are safely able to share. And so I think that's something that we're going to take back with us, certainly as educators, as we get back into the classroom. But I think seeing representation, people that are in the world of work, that look like us, that have had our life experiences. Again, I think we can only all, really truly speak based on our shoes. But I think that awareness of what other people's shoes may feel like is something that can be a catalyst to creating that positive change. And one thing that I have seen that I think is so important that we can do in higher education, which is to educate each student about their value. One thing that I have done, I've created some career development courses. That's my area of research. The full-time MBA program and the PM program have now made 2 of those courses required as part of the curriculum. And it's based on what I call working you, which simply means when you're valued for who you are as a unique individual, a human being, you're working you. And that's the goal. When I interview people who have been super successful throughout their career, there's a sense of intrinsic motivation that's driven their careers from A to Z. And I think that begins, yes, with the awareness about other people's experience, but also the awareness about our value. So we don't feel less than. And every student brings a tremendous human value based on their demographics, based on their personality, all of these things that are part of this DEI equation. And I think the more we can do as educators to make sure each student feels the self-efficacy and the capacity that they have to achieve their dreams and recognize the value that they bring because of who they are as a human being, I think is key to creating a more equitable, certainly a more equitable workforce.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Kirk. I think that's such great sage advice, particularly for the students on the call or early career professionals who, I'll just share my own personal story. I'm the child of immigrants to this country, first generation born here. And I was often told, just put your head down, do the work, and you will be rewarded. And unfortunately, that's not often how corporate culture works. And I think for underrepresented minorities and groups who may be the first in their family to go to higher education, to pursue higher education, or work in a corporate setting, or suddenly enter a corporate setting and are the one and only, it can feel very challenging to recognize your value. We talk a lot about imposter syndrome, and I heard that it was a great commentary this past week where someone said, it shouldn't be imposter syndrome because that then puts the onus on the individual, but really it's imposter thoughts. And I think we've all had moments where we second guess, like, oh my gosh, do I really belong here? Do they realize what they hired? Maybe they're expecting so much of me that I can't deliver. And it's just fleeting thoughts. And it's sometimes just that mindset. And Kirk, to your point, recognizing the value that each of us brings to the workplace is so key in building that confidence in yourself. So thank you for sharing that. We talked a little bit about, as Steffi, we've heard from you about that natural progression of being, individual lawyers taking on activities because it's something of a personal passion, but then also organizations starting to follow suit and making it much more process-based or much more rigorous and systematic. And I'm curious to hear from you, we talked a little bit about it shouldn't be incumbent on the underrepresented groups to educate others. And yet when you find yourself in more of a senior leadership position, you have an opportunity to take identity and advocate on behalf of others, talking about
So Jen, I think you're having a connectivity issue, but I think you were about to ask me some just questions about how people can be, anti-racist.
And in our prep call, we talked a little bit about, the impact that the remote working environment has had on law firm life. So just check here.
Well, it looks like Jen had some technical difficulties and jumped off for a second, but I think what she was asking me was just some questions about how people can be, anti-racist in their work, and then also asking how law firms, the impact from COVID, the pandemic, how that has also helped in some respects. So it's interesting touching on what both Peter and Kirk said. I think it's really important that, that it's not just incumbent on the people who come from those diverse backgrounds, and that really it's important for everybody to just be a little bit more eyes wide open, but also gracious, both to the people who've gone through the experiences, but also to the people who are going through the journey of learning to open their eyes and to listen a little bit better. And so, Peter talked about hiring practices where you don't just hire the person who was already maybe in because they had the connections and they, that sort of a thing. But it extends to all the different things that you do within whatever your career path is. For example, I was doing a retreat for our firm, and it occurred to me that I was the only woman for like a lot of the programming. And it wasn't something, and the people, my firm is wonderful. The person I was presenting with is a wonderful person, but I just said, hey, did you notice this? And he was like, oh my goodness, I didn't notice it. I just know, these guys were my friends and they are really good at presenting. And I was like, oh yeah, so why don't we just, here's some other suggestions, right? And so there was no malintent to it at all. It's just that sometimes people don't stop and think. So I think being anti-racist or anti, whatever, whether it's gender equity, sexual orientation, whatever it is, it's stopping and taking that extra step to think a little bit more inclusively and to stop and say, okay, what's different here? Giving opportunities to people, we have like a podcast, for example, and I rigorously look through it to make sure we have people every so often that are represented. And looking to give people those opportunities. And Jen, you asked whether there's been any changes just because of the pandemic and how that's all worked. So on the positive side, if we try to find silver linings to this last year, there's lots of ways that law firms have had to evolve that I think are going to allow law firms to be more inclusive. And I like to say for women, but it's not just women, it's also women and whatever you identify as, people who are maybe more active in the parenting role if they have kids, which, the definition of what's a parent has changed in terms of people who are more active or not. And being able to work from home or to do some meetings from home or things like that have allowed access to being able to, work at different times, get things done. Half the times, maybe I don't tell everybody at my firm, but I'm getting dinner done while I'm actually on a call with opposing counsel, and I can still hold it, but you're able to do a little bit more at the same time. And then Also, in terms of access to justice, being able to appear remotely at court hearings in front of judges. So there's one thing to be in trial where, you know, people should be in person, especially so witnesses can be heard and that sort of thing. But a lot of what we do are status, it's check-ins, it's meetings. You know, if you think of any business, they have meetings about meetings. Well, we have meetings about trial, we have meetings about the law, like a lot of them. And the ability to just check in for 15, 20 minutes on a Zoom call, as opposed to traveling to and from, you know, for 3 hours when really you're only going to be in front of the judge for 15 minutes, has allowed us to keep the cost down. And I've been able to take on more pro bono for this reason too, because you can provide more access, being able to kind of seamlessly, virtually step in for different things. I do think though that this year has required all of us to think a little bit more and give people a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt, because there's been a greater need for some people to create the care, whether it's for children, pets, animals, family members, friends, all that kind of thing. And I know, so I'm Hispanic, and so certainly in my culture, it's a very big deal to care for the other people in your family. And I know it is in lots of cultures, but I'm just saying, like, if there's these cultural differences that I think allowing for people to have more flexibility, but also being mindful that people are probably carrying pretty large burdens, that's been something that we've all had to be more considerate of.
And, you know, I'd love to add one thing to that, because in terms of I think one of the big things this year for us has been to fundamentally challenge even how we define some of our terms. So what does it mean for somebody to be the best candidate for a job? Or what does it mean for them to be qualified for a job? You know, we talked yesterday in our prep call about internships and the fact that, you know, we used to hire our interns for entry-level positions because they knew our company, we knew they were successful and all of that. But then we stopped to say our interns mostly were people of privilege, to be able to come to Los Angeles, to afford to work here for the summer, even though they're paid, you know, all of that. It was a very different, they were privileged to begin with. So it wasn't fair to give former interns a leg up. You know, I'm a former lawyer also. When I practiced law in the 90s, it was quite a while ago, but I was at a law firm that had, you know, a bunch of lawyers with fancy degrees in Harvard and Yale and all the rest. And then there were lawyers from Brooklyn College and, you know, all different law schools. I cannot tell you how many times a lawyer from a less pedigreed law school was one of the most exceptional lawyers in our office. And yet, over time and time again, those elite law school graduates will have the advantage in hiring everywhere. And, you know, law is very particular and it's very degree driven. In our business, it's not. And we actually stopped recently and said, why do we have so many jobs that require a 4-year college degree when there is no reason this job requires a 4-year college degree? So we're striking that off jobs now that don't require it, because not everybody needs that.
Yeah, and just even adding one more thought to what you were saying, it's even like in, you know, when we do our recruitment, there's a part that talks about how the people, you know, appeared in the interview and whatnot. And some people come across really, really polished, and it might be that they've been able to have the benefit of being around people who've talked at the higher level, whether it's about job or just, you know, in general, it's a different level of sophistication, or been able to train on interviewing or all those sorts of things. And for some people, they might not have the polish because there was no reason for them to have had the polish. And I know, I by the way, I'm a alumni of USC as well. I went to USC for law school. And that was something that we did, was we provide, and still, you know, with our students and alumni, opportunities for mock interviews and that sort of thing. And I think it's really important for people in their organizations, whether it's the law school or USC, which does a great job, or it's also the companies that are volunteering their people or even offering these trainings, because there's a lot of that people just haven't had the training. And I think everybody, when they're doing the interviews, should give everybody a little bit of the benefit of the doubt on those sorts of things. It's kind of just like, you know, benefit of the doubt on schooling. And just from law schools, there's some schools that maybe aren't as pedigreed, but you know what? It turns out a lot of those schools are also part-time programs, and people were working at the same time as going to law school.
Absolutely. Thank you both for sharing those great insights. And Steffi, thank you for stepping in when my Wi-Fi cut out on me a little bit. So
No
I'm
problem.
glad you were able to share your comments. It's one of the challenges of working remotely. So thank you all for your patience and flexibility, and such great points that were shared particularly around the recruitment piece, right? And Peter, I love, just how you're challenging, what is the best candidate? I just had that conversation here at SVB and other organizations as, again, my recruiting background. It's like, can we shift from talking about culture fit versus culture add? Like, I want to have that candidate or have that hire who's actually bringing something different to the table, not just fitting the old boys network or whatever norms we have established, whether it's that pedigree or that specific network. And I think that's so key. And Steffi, to your point, the interview process now, especially again, we're in a virtual environment, most of us are doing virtual interviews, which takes a whole nother level when you're now meeting someone in their home and they may have a virtual background, they may not. And so they might have kids showing up in the background, roommates, pets, other family members, what have you. And so there's an element there of the unexpected and also just the authenticity. And so giving each other grace, I think it's important for organizations, particularly for us, like we're our hiring managers, interview teams, we're doing training on them to mitigate bias whenever it comes up, because they might think, oh, someone's not showing up so well on screen, or it's in a loud, noisy background. Well, they may have very different circumstances that we have the privilege of setting aside quiet spaces where other candidates may not. And so that's something to create space and grace for as well. Great. Thank you. I'm seeing a ton of questions coming through and we'll hopefully get to them in a little bit. I know a couple of things that we wanted to address, particularly given our audience again today. We know a lot of students and young professionals are energized by the momentum and social activism that has taken place. I know Kirk, you spoke to a little bit of just the activity for students. And Peter, one of the things we talked about in our prep call was, you've created all these different committees. And in fact, if you could repeat them, please, because someone had asked that in the chat. What's a membership of those committees? Because we talked about who's sitting at the table and who's able to lift their voice. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The committees were a sourcing and outreach committee, retention and leadership committee, and a culture and employee engagement committee. And the membership is entry level all the way through most senior executives in the organization. We have a similar issue and challenge that other people have, in that we don't have much diversity in our senior ranks, but we do an incredible job at our entry level and director and below ranks. And so that's one of the things we're trying to change. That's why leadership is a pillar of one of those, and retention, so that, we can keep people. The committee, I saw another thing in the questions about whether or not we compensate people for participation in those committees. Not in a formal sense, not like you get a stipend for being on that committee. But I will say this year we did consider it as one of the factors in terms of bonus for people. And we saw participation as a big value add to DreamWorks. And so people were given extra for participating in these committees. Not senior executives, because we expect the senior executives to participate, but other people were given that benefit. And the other question that was in here that I thought was interesting was this question about how do you deal with executives that don't want to be a part of DEI programs? And that's been an interesting challenge this year. I myself, growing up as a gay man, growing up as a Jew, knowing there was a lot of homophobia and a lot of anti-Semitism in the world, it was just part of my socialization. And so I have no problem speaking about issues of otherness. So I've stepped up because I felt I was able to, and I wanted to lead by example. There are other senior leaders in this organization and every organization I've worked at who do not want to touch these issues with a 10-foot pole. And people have said, people I work with, some who are senior have said, I don't want to touch that issue, because they feel there is no win. They feel they will always say the wrong thing or step in something or insult someone, and they are scared of doing that. And maybe they're coming from a place of respect, maybe they're coming from a place of fear. But what we've said to those senior leaders this year is that's not acceptable anymore. You have to talk about these issues. You have to talk to your team about what's going on in the world. you have to understand and meet them where they are at now. And what we've tried to talk to the whole company about is being kind to people who are trying to be better, even if they are not being perfect. So, allowing people to tread into areas they're not comfortable with, and making it a safe enough space, as long as they are doing things, with positive intention, that they're not going to get raked over the coals if they step wrong.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Peter. I think those are such great highlights, particularly around this notion of discomfort. And we have to get comfortable with the uncomfortable. And Kirk, I'd love to pose this question to you, because in our prep call, you talked about, true change requires self-awareness and regulation, right? And that active listening and empathy as well. And one of our questions that just came through is, if you could speak, maybe provide insight into the topic of emotional intelligence and unconscious bias as it relates.
Absolutely. I mean, well, the foundation of emotional intelligence is self-awareness, right? And the second is self-regulation. Third is self-motivation. And I don't think you can really have motivation to change relative to our topic today without the level of emotional intelligence of self-awareness and self-regulation. And I think what Peter was just talking about is so important, because in order to get everyone at the table in a positive way, I think creating that level of awareness, there has to be an opportunity for everyone to be willing to listen, even if they don't like what they're hearing. Change is uncomfortable, right? Human beings are wired to fear the unknown. And to a great extent, change is the unknown, the great unknown. And depending on our shoes, how uncomfortable that change is going to vary. But I think recognizing that difference and allowing ourselves to listen without judgment. And I think that's key relative to this self-awareness. Empathy, and I saw that someone mentioned emotional intelligence, the 5 components, I mentioned 3. The 4th one is empathy. And from a communication standpoint, that really manifests in listening. It's not about being everybody's best friend. It's about listening with purpose. And that sort of is a gateway to that awareness that I think you're talking about. So I think that understanding the role that emotional intelligence plays in creating that level of awareness and allowing us to regulate when we need to maybe be forgiving, when we need to maybe not get our back up, or actually express our anger and not think about conflict as negative. Conflict is a gateway to positive change. So, conflict and anger can be separated. So not looking at conflict and disagreement as a negative, but embracing it as a positive element of how we can get from A to B. And emotional intelligence is certainly a key that's going to allow us to listen without judgment, to create that level of self-awareness and self-regulate in a way that's going to keep the momentum going in a positive way towards that destination of greater equity that we're all seeking to create.
Thank you for that, Kirk. And I'm seeing some notes from our producer. We've got so many questions coming in. We want to be able to answer as many of them as we can. We've tried to weave in the questions throughout our dialogue today. And so pose it to the panel right now. Are folks available to stay on a few minutes past the hour? I see
Absolutely.
Peter's not. If you nod, so if our audience is open to staying a little longer as well, we'll continue the dialogue. So thank you all for that. Kirk, I want to build on the concept of like what you said, just change is uncomfortable and conflict is actually okay. It's part of the growth and learning in this space, which is so much needed. Steffi, you've talked a little bit about the education and awareness you've done within your organization, your law firm, that it isn't just on the incumbent on the underrepresented groups to do all the educating. So I'm curious, how are you educating sort of the majority group to engage in some of these conversations?
Well, I certainly think even just like at the larger level and then on the more personal level, it's important to talk about these issues. So I have plenty of people that I've built really good alliances with, that I feel comfortable talking with them. And I've actually, even just had conversations with them like, hey, so-and-so, just so you know, like this could be, taken this way, here's the way, you mentioned this or whatever. And having those discussions one-on-one with people, I've started doing a lot more of. And then, on a larger level, like I said, making sure that people are thinking when we're in these leadership positions or where we're doing staffing, or we're having article written, or any of the, making sure that we're stopping and thinking of everybody who's a part of the process and the voice and given the opportunity. So it's not always the same person who gets called to, report on this or that or whatever. And so it's kind of, I've been doing this just on a one-on-one level. And that's the thing. I think lots of people think, oh my goodness, I need to do so much for me to actually make an impact. And I think it's important for us to just take a step back, and you can make little baby steps all the time that make an impact. And don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean you could just necessarily stay on the sidelines, but every single day you can have a conversation with somebody that makes an impact. And it's in doing it in a respectful way. As Peter said, and as Kirk said, conflict isn't a bad thing. You can tell people, when Kirk was talking, I was like, oh, you're meant to be a lawyer. I mean, that's what, conflict can be a good thing. That's how you lead to resolution. And sometimes it's hard to separate the emotion. And certainly, if you've been had some of the personal experiences that have caused trauma, it's hard to separate the emotion. But then I think it's important for everybody else in the conversation to recognize that and give a little bit of grace to somebody who's being more upset about something. And so, every day there's opportunities to have those little, those little things. And so it's, if you're in a leadership position, if you're respected, or even if you're not in a leadership position, but you feel comfortable raising an issue, either with a trusted ally or in a group or whatever, it's all those sorts of steps along the way and that also make impactful change.
Great, thank you for sharing that, Steffi. I completely agree. A lot of what you said resonates with me, particularly for those folks who are worried about putting their foot in their mouth. And I tell them, I've been in the DEI space for decades now, and I still put my foot in my mouth. So we're not always going to get it right. And I think sometimes just by having the words or having the prompts to interrupt bias when it happens, whether you're the person who is the unintended victim of a careless statement, or if you're getting feedback on, hey, that comment that you made just didn't land right, being open to that feedback. And then also if you're maybe a bystander who doesn't want to sort of swoop in and be the savior you don't want to disempower someone from speaking up and using their voice, but at the same time, making an observation like, hey, that hit me a little funny. How did that hit you? And so I know, Peter, in our prep call, we talked about, creating that safe space for conversation and the bumpiness that comes along in that road. What have you and your organization done?
We just faced it head on. We've, as I said, we've told people they have to talk to their teams about DEI. They have to talk to their teams about Black Lives Matter, about what's happening in the world, and they need to check in with people to see how they're feeling. And then, we basically told our teams, you have to engage, and we won't accept anything less than engaging on these issues. And so when we started up these DEI committees, there were some people who signed up and other people who didn't. And we went around and told people that we, especially senior leaders who had not stepped up, that we expected them to step up and we expected them to participate. We expected them to do the homework they needed to do on themselves. It's not okay to just say, I don't feel like I have the language to speak to this from my experience. We just said that's not an acceptable answer anymore. So the only answer is, okay, if you don't feel ready, what do you need? We will give you the resources. And the resources are abundant inside our company and inside NBC Universal in terms of training, in terms of exposure to speakers, in terms of literature, in terms of people willing to sit and educate you as a senior executive. So it's not okay to say you're not comfortable. Your comfort isn't the issue anymore. So it's really been dealing with it head on and letting people know often and strongly that they can't be on the sidelines anymore, that that's not going to be looked on well, and that it could affect them in other ways in a corporation. And I would say I said to a couple of my colleagues, like, you know, if you don't step up on this, you're just gonna look like a dinosaur too. If you can't do it just based on wanting to do the right thing and move things forward, do it based on your own self-preservation, because if you are not engaging in a meaningful way with DEI efforts in this climate, this business climate, that's just a mistake for your own career. So just being forceful with people.
Thank you for walking us through that, Peter. And I think the leadership expectations, just setting that as an organization, that these are table stakes. It's part of being a good leader, to be inclusive. It goes a long way. And to your point, you know, there was a question around what kind of training can we offer or resources. I think a lot of us has touched on that. It's not just unconscious bias training. That's one piece of it. But studies have shown unconscious bias training by itself is not going to solve everything. It's how then do you apply the takeaways from that training and give people an opportunity to experience that, to put into practice what they've learned. And oftentimes it's having these conversations. It's continuing to bring in outside speakers, which some of you have mentioned, to just continue raising that awareness. It's a muscle that we need to continue to build and flex. So thank you on that. I'm looking at all the different questions coming in, which is great. I love how engaged our audience is. I want to try to get to some of them before we close up with some takeaway points from our wonderful panel. I've seen a lot of questions around gender inclusion, whether it's women leaving the workplace due to less than inclusive environments, and or the pay disparity that's coming up. And I'm curious for folks, for any of the panels, I'll open this up. Whoever wants to jump in first, any thoughts or reactions to the gender inclusion piece?
You know,
I mean, it's a
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, you know, we've been talking a lot about what companies can do internally on all these inclusion efforts, but it's also interesting. I think companies don't realize what power they also have. I mean, especially companies like DreamWorks, certainly, with, you know, the resources that they're using as well. I know, like on the law firm side, we've increasingly had more clients where, you know, their companies are more conscious and they're actually requesting certain numbers. And it's not just, it used to be, okay, you have the people come to the pitch, but it's companies actually looking deeper and saying, I'm actually looking at the billable hour work that was done, and I'd like a breakdown of the efforts that have been done by different people of different backgrounds, right? And it's not just, it's actually meaningful work as opposed to just being put on the poster to hire us. They're looking for deeper analytics. And that's something, and I'm using the example with law firms just because that's my world, but I think companies don't realize how much power they actually have. So even if they're struggling to find a way internally, there's certainly ways externally that they can kind of flex those anti-racist muscles, if you will, including with who they're hiring and not hiring within their company, but, you know, the companies that they're using and lawyers and CPAs or whatever the services are. That's something you can certainly look to, and that can help with gender equity and all the different types of equity we've been talking about.
Yeah. You know, I've been in a unusual position. My boss is a woman, the president of DreamWorks, Margie Cohen. Her boss, the chairwoman of Universal, Donna Langley, is a woman. All of my direct reports, who are senior vice presidents and executive vice presidents, are women. You know, I've worked for my boss on and off for 15 years. And she taught me 15 years ago, when she still had school-aged kids at home, she was the one that educated me on what it meant. Quite frankly, at the time, she spoke more about working moms. It should be working parents generally, but we know that in our society, working moms still bear the vast majority of the work in families. And so I've always had, and I've always encouraged other people in my organization to have a very open idea that that nobody should even take even the tiniest step back or the tiniest. There should be no impediment in their path due to family obligations. And it's our job together to figure out how that works for people. So it's always been, you know, your workday may not resemble my workday, and your workday may mean that you're sending me notes on a script at 10:30 at night, but I quit working at 5:30 because I don't have kids, and my day works differently than your day. And within reason, accepting that we can get together and create something new. It works better for senior executives than it does for people in jobs that are more regimented. But we've tried to encourage as much flexibility as we can throughout the organization, because you don't just want to recruit amazing women to your organization. You want, once again, to have them to build a career and to have them feel like they have a place that's responsive to their needs professionally and their life as a whole.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Peter. Just the workplace flexibility. I think Steffi's touched on this a little bit as well, just the silver lining of the pandemic. It's given us a lot more flexibility with our work schedules, which can hopefully help address the gender inequalities, both on the home front and in the work front. And also, Steffi, you touched on the company's power in terms of like supplier diversity programs. So a lot of companies, they look to where we're spending our money with outside vendors, such as law firms or CPAs or other professional services. And we have the spend and the buying power of our own dollars. And a lot more organizations are looking at where's their money going? How are we supporting women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses? And not just is it something that our clients are looking for, but also our investors and our shareholders. So as a publicly traded company, Silicon Valley Bank, we're getting a lot of questions from our own investors and shareholders as to what are we doing in the DE&I space. So there's, I think, a lot more levers of accountability from the external market that companies and organizations are facing. And Kirk, it looks like you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I wanted to just add one thing in, and particularly for the students that are here listening. While we are waiting for corporate America, right, to catch up and to provide equity and to provide equal pay for everyone, including whether it's based on the value of your gender or race or sexual orientation. While we are waiting for that to happen, going back to something I said earlier, I think once we can recognize the value that we bring to the world of work as a unique individual, whether it's our talents and skills as part of our functional value, whether it's our demographics in terms of our human value, all of these value points that we bring to the world of work, there's correlating points at every company out there, and they will either reward or punish us in varying degrees. And so I just want to make sure that the students recognize, once you get your arms around the value that your diversity in all of its incarnations has, you have the power to go out and find a job that will maximize who you are and reward that value. So Peter said something earlier that I thought was really important. Senior leadership at a lot of companies may not reflect the diversity that's in the pipeline. So I think having students taking a look at what those pipelines look like. I always advise people to take a look at the senior leadership. Do you see people that are reflective of who you are, of your value? And particularly when it comes to gender, when it comes to ethnicity, sexual orientation, some of these quantifiable demographic points. If we can see ourselves in that organization in leadership roles, we probably are going to have an opportunity to also be valued for who we are. We have some shared identity with those folks. And I think it's so important to look at the leadership pipeline. And these are things that we can find out and learn in a transparent world that historically people weren't able to find out. Also, information interview. Since this is at USC, that Trojan network is real. And there's 360-some thousand plus alumni on LinkedIn. And I can't tell you how many students I have had that have reached out and networked and learned about what that company character is of employers they're considering to get a better idea. If the pay is going to be fair, if promotional opportunities are going to be fair, again, based on the value of their individual diversity. So I think while we wait for everything to get better in corporate America, I don't want people to forget the power that we have to place ourselves in the right environments. And we also have the opportunity to make a plan to get out of environments where we're not rewarded and we are being disenfranchised, to get into better fits where we are valued for who we are.
Thank you for sharing that, Kirk. And, if I can speak to, there was another question around like legislation. Is there legislation that could support DEI initiatives? And there certainly can be. And I can think of a couple of examples. One is just board representation is another thing that organizations are looking at. And there is legislation now that is requiring boards to include women, a certain percentage of gender diversity, as well as minority representation on board. So that's underway. And on the pay equity front, SVB is a global organization. And so in the UK, once you hit a certain size of company or certain size of workforce, you have to report out on pay equity. So there is that transparency and external accountability that's coming into place. I'm sure there will be more around that done in other countries, hopefully the US as well. And I think, Steffi, we had during our conversation, just talking about benefits that organizations offer and the utilization and the practicality of the benefits, particularly around supporting gender inclusion.
Yeah, so one of the things that companies can do, and it's interesting, it just happens to be you're a young lawyer you're working with, and sometimes you put off having children because of advancement, and then it just happens to be a trick of the universe that you're up for partner right around the same time where you've got a clock without going into too much information. But it was interesting, the firm listened to what women had to say, and they created a policy that was a ramp up policy, with the understanding that when people come back from leave, and also paternity leave as well, or just any sort of FMLA leave, that when you come back, that it takes a little while to get your plate full through no fault of your own. And then, with our own firm, it was when they were rolling out the program, it was a woman in the audience that said, well, what about before I go on leave? When I'm walking around 8-9 months pregnant, people just stop giving me work. And I think it's really important for companies to listen and not to be too bogged down by bureaucracy. The comment was made in one of our many, many offices, and before we know, it was kind of lifted up, and then we created a ramp down and a ramp up policy. And there's these sorts of things that you just wouldn't even think of. And so the way that it actually works in practice is that when the associate goes up for partner, you actually cut out that ramp up and ramp down period. Instead, you prorate the other time that wasn't part of that period across the whole year. So when you're being voted on and people are seeing your numbers, they're seeing a whole number. They're not seeing a gap of 200, 400 hours or whatever it may be, with the goal being that instead of just saying in the meetings, don't worry about their hours this year, they were on FMLA. It's instead you're actually showing numbers that are strong, and you're just taking that out of the equation. You're taking that bias completely out of the decision-making process. And there's those sorts of things that companies can do. And certainly, as Kirk said as well, valuing yourself, when you're looking for positions, going for places where they do think about this, and companies where they're willing to listen to comments from the people who are actually going through it, as opposed to people who maybe haven't gone through the experience, saying, what the program should look like.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And I want to be mindful. I know we're in the midst of Women's History Month and we're talking about gender inclusion, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention, this inclusion also extends to our LGBT community and our non-binary individuals or transgender individuals. And that's something else to think about. We talked about, it's not just maternal leave policies, but really just general caregiver leave policies and how that benefits you. And there is an opportunity for our early career professionals to explore what are the transgender policies or LGBTQ inclusive policies that an organization is offering to demonstrate how inclusive that work culture is. We're coming up right on time. And so I always like to leave an audience with a nugget of information or piece of advice they can walk away with, because we talked about taking actions as individuals and as organizations. So if I could ask each panelist to just quickly opine on, what's one piece of advice you would give your past self, say at age 20 or 25? And Steffi, let's start with you.
This is something that we've touched upon. Kirk certainly has hit on it quite a few times. Recognizing your own value and how powerful you are, and recognizing where you are, and with the idea being that put yourself somewhere where you're going to be able to thrive, Or even if you're somewhere where maybe it's not that type of environment, recognize where you are and recognizes this is still something that's good for you for your advancement. So my firm's been wonderful, but certainly law firms as a whole, we don't have the best numbers. And so I've thought that, rather than trying to lead to go somewhere where it's just a lot more inclusion of these things, I'm gonna try to be a part of the solution to it as well. And being somewhere where I'm not allowed, but able to be the solution. So recognizing that you do have a lot of power of choice, and if that's choice to be somewhere that is already like that, or to be somewhere where you recognize what you're going to be able to get from that place or add to that place.
Thank you, Steffi. And Peter, what advice would you give your 20 or 25-year-old self?
Use your voice and know your power. I think it ties into what Steffi and Kirk were both saying. When I was a young associate at a law firm I went to Hastings, and I started a law firm here in LA called Dewey Ballantyne back in the 90s, 92. I was the only openly gay attorney in the office. I did that because that's how I lived my life, but I also did that because I actually felt like it gave me more power in a way. And I felt like expressing my truest self made me more comfortable, made me more powerful. And I think that's true today more than ever. So if you find yourself at a company, find those avenues to express yourself, to put your identity forward if you're comfortable doing that. For instance, in our company, there's ERGs, employee resource groups, which are incredibly vital and powerful in the organization. So if you're a Black employee and you want to get involved with our Black employee network, do it. Have a voice there. Get involved with diversity, equity, and inclusion committees. It gives you exposure to senior leadership in ways you wouldn't get otherwise. And so use yourself, use your diversity as a way to get yourself noticed and to get yourself opportunities, because I think it will in the near future.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. And Kirk, last but not least, what advice would you give your past self?
Yeah, I think it's simple. Believe that you deserve to be successful. And I think that goes back to everyone being able to recognize the value that they bring to the world of work in terms of their human value, their unique talents and skills, and who they want to be in the world. And that all of that has value, and you deserve just as much as everyone else to reach your dreams and be successful.
Thank you. What a great note to end on. And so I am so grateful and appreciative for this amazing panel and the insights you've shared today. Patty, I'll turn it over to you if you have any closing remarks you'd like to share.
Yes, this was an amazing panel. Thank you, Peter, Steffi, Professor Snyder, and Jen for sharing your experiences with us. Thank you for the attendees for participating and submitting great questions. I also want to thank again Outlaw, my co-board members at USC Lambda LGBT Alumni Association and the USC Student Alumni Society for all the help in organizing this event. Finally, a special thanks to Blair Chapman from USC, who worked side by side with me in organizing this panel. This has been an amazing experience and one that I hope to replicate in the future. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.